We're talking about the Gentiles today, and we're going to talk about the reason I wanted to do this was because this is a question that's come up a lot online. I've seen the past few weeks in person, and it's this whole idea of like, who are the Gentiles? Because we need to know who the Gentiles are, because there's certain things in the Bible that apply to Israel, and there's certain things that apply to the Gentiles, and we need to know which group we're in. Lots of it has to do with biology. We see early on in the Bible it's based on genetics. We see that shift as we go. This could be a multi-session series if we really wanted a deep dive, but I'm going to try to keep it kind of relatively basic today. Okay. So when we look at the, and this is old hat for most of us, but definition of terms, when we look at Gentiles or nations, our English word, in the Hebrew that's going to come up with Strong's H1471, goy. Has anyone heard that term goy or the plural goyim? Yeah. Not to be confused with the beans you get in the grocery store, goya. That's a whole other thing. We're a bunch of, we're mixed nuts and fruits around here. We're not beans. Okay, so the King James translates that as nation, heathen, and heathen, in our Western mind, we tend to think of like savage, drooling barbarians. It basically just means someone who's not following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We can also say pagan, Gentiles, or just people, like the peoples around us. They're not us, they're the peoples around us. When we look in the Greek, for that word Gentiles or nations, we see Strong's G1484, which means ethnos. So we get the word ethnic group from. So that has a connotation, and it can be like this either way, but it can be based on like racial lines, our biology, or it can be based on like national cultural lines, and oftentimes it mixes. It's more than one. But the King James translates that as Gentiles, more often than not, nation, heathen, people, just like in the Hebrew. And then we've got another word that we're going to look at a little bit. It's relevant, but it's not as relevant, and it's the Hebrew word ger. This is H1616. This is where we get aliens in the Bible. If you've ever wondered, are aliens in the Bible? Yes, they are. They're just not from up there. They're from the places around Israel. That's what ger means. Stranger, alien, sojourner. Stranger, you could couple it with other words. When Solomon, I had it in my head because the name Gershom Solomon. So when Moses names his son Gershom, it's because he's a stranger in a strange land. It comes from this root word ger. What's that? GR in the Hebrew, GAR is how they have it transliterated. So like you'll see, and we won't get into it today, but when you read especially the Torah, the first 5 books, you see this distinction. You'll see these verses that talk about like the stranger among you, the sojourner among you, the alien. There's a distinction basically, and we'll get into this a little bit, but just to kind of summarize, once you have Israel established in the land, you have 2 groups of non-Israelite people. You have the general nations all around. They would be the goy, the goyim. And then you have the ger. So the ger are basically your roots. These are Gentiles from outside the nation of Israel that came into Israel and more or less assimilated. Okay, so they're not biologically Israel, but spiritually they are. So we're kind of all ger in a way. And we'll get to that as we go. But just to set this up, let's go to the beginning, Genesis. And we will have Q&A at the end of this. So if you're taking notes and you have specific questions, we'll try to address them. This isn't going to cover the whole topic in minute detail, but it is going to try to at least kind of clear up the distinctions. So Genesis 17, we'll read the whole chapter. We're going to do some whole chapter reading today. I hope that's okay. Genesis 17. Now when Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Elohim Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and Elohim talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. Now, I'm going to pause right there. Abraham is the father of the Gentiles. He's going to be a father of a multitude of goy, or goyim. So, Abraham was not Jewish. I know that sounds crazy, but he wasn't Jewish. He's the father of the nations. Of course, Israel, if we're just looking in technical worldly terms, Israel is a nation. They are a people group just like everybody else. Verse 5, No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. Abram means exalted father or high father. And then Abraham means father of nations. So literally, he's the father of the Gentiles. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be Elohim to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their Elohim, or their God. Elohim said further to Abraham, Now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who was born in the house, or who was bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house, or who is bought with your money, shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. So I just want to pause right there. Abraham had at least 300 people in his household that were not his biological descendants. Every one of them that's a male has to be circumcised. Now, compared to Abraham, if we're going to say that Abraham was Israel, and we know he pre-existed Israel because that's Jacob, but let's say Israel is just a stand-in for the people of Yahweh. Abraham definitely was a person of Yahweh. These people in his household, compared to him, would be Gentiles. And they're all getting circumcised, and they're all being brought into this covenant. So right off the bat, we have this idea of Gentiles being a part of the covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not some New Testament thing where all of a sudden we have this Gentile church that's taken over and Jesus is taking the wheel and driving us away from the Torah. Like we're not doing that. It's set up from the beginning. To continue, where was it? Verse 14. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Then Elohim said to Abraham, As for Sarai, she's going to get a name change too, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. That same word, goy. Kings of people will come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to Elohim, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But Elohim said, No, but Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, or Yitzhak. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. We're going to talk about this whole descendant thing as we go. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and I will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. It's that same word, goy. It's the singular version. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. When he finished talking with him, Elohim went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all the servants who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's household, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the very same day, as Elohim had said to him. Now Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised. And the very same day Abraham was circumcised and Ishmael his son, all the men of his household who were born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner were circumcised with him. Now, with Ishmael's about 13 at this point. He is a son of Abraham, but he's not going to be of the lineage of Isaac. And so you could argue that Ishmael as a person was brought under this covenant as well. Now we see his descendants don't fall under the covenant. They are opting out for different reasons. But he himself was brought under the covenant as someone who we would not consider an Israelite. Okay, so let's go fast forwarding to Genesis 48. We're going to get a term introduced to us here that's going to make its presence known in the New Testament. And like I said, as we go through this, it's fairly basic, but I do think it's important to establish it. And if anybody is of the two-house persuasion, this is probably already in your head in some capacity. But, you know, it never hurts to have a refresher, and especially for people who are kind of new to this walk and kind of trying to sort it out. So Genesis 48, we'll read the whole chapter again because it's all important. It came about after these things that Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is sick." So he took his sons Manasseh and Ephraim with him. That name Ephraim is going to be really important as we go. When it was told to Jacob, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you," Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "Elohim Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. Now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. Now as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephraim. And I buried her there on the way to Ephraim, that is Bethlehem. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, Who are these? And he's calling, this is Israel, this is Joseph. Well, Joseph has brought it to Jacob. Joseph said to his father, They are my sons, whom Elohim has given me. So he said, Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, Elohim has let me see your children as well. Then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand towards Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. He blessed Joseph and said, The Elohim before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the Elohim who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and my name may live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and they may grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Now, this is important because culturally, what he's doing is he's passing on the blessing of the firstborn. And the right hand represents strength. So the fact that he used his right hand to bless the secondborn was kind of a shock thing. We just don't do that. It's culturally taboo. It's like, what are you doing, Dad? Are you losing it? When Joseph saw, this is verse 17, that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him, and he grasped his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head, because he was firstborn. Joseph said to his father, Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. But his father refused, and he said, I know, my son, I know. He will also become a people, and he will also be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. Now, you don't have to say anything, but show of hands, does anyone have a translation that says something besides multitude of nations? Any other words in the English? Monica's got one. What's yours say?
Populous.
Populous. Okay. Karen? Completeness. Okay, this is all good. We're on the right track here. I won't spoil it because we're going to get to the payout here in a minute. Verse 20, he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, may Elohim make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but Elohim will be with you, and bring you back to the land of your fathers. I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. So we've got a line of patriarchy here, and these terms are going to become important. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. They're both interchangeable as we go. His son Joseph was his favorite son. He just took Joseph's second born, Ephraim, and gave him the birthright blessing. So we start to see, like, if we look in the news, we'll see things like Washington says da 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 da. We all know that means the American government. The city of Washington isn't collectively getting together and saying, let's all say this. So we see these. We're going to see Samaria later. We're going to see Israel. We're going to see all these names. And so, like Ephraim, Joseph, Israel, they're all kind of interchangeable as we go. They all basically mean the same people group. Okay, so Romans. We're going to go to Romans. I don't normally skip into the New Testament this early, but this is relevant. We're going to go to Romans 11. This is where we get to learn that there's a special tree, and you can be cut off or grafted in, and it's your choice. Romans 11, we're going to read verses 25 through 27. Romans 11, 25 through 27. For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery. Some people call this the mystery of the Gentiles that he's talking about here. So that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness or unrighteousness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And so what we just read earlier, my translation said a multitude of nations. Some said completeness. I forgot what yours said, Monique. Populace, okay? If we take the Greek here in the New Testament and take it back to the Greek Old Testament or the Septuagint, that's the same word. The fullness of the Gentiles. So we could go back to Genesis 48 and we could say that through Ephraim, we're going to see the fullness of the Gentiles. Okay, that's going to become huge. So the fullness of the Gentiles equals Ephraim, Joseph, Israel, however you want to look at it, being a multitude of nations, which obviously at the time they weren't. So we're going to look at how that happened and what it means. Let's go back into the Tanakh, the Older Testament. We're going to go to Deuteronomy 30, one of my favorite chapters in the whole Word. We're just going to read the first 6 verses. So it shall be when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind in all the nations where Yahweh your Elohim has banished you. Is anybody here not in the land of Israel? Yeah? I see, Dan, you're not there? No? Okay. We're all literally banished from the land of, we're in exile right now. The Jews call it the diaspora. Okay? And so, whether you're talking about Jews in the flesh, whether you're talking about Ephraim, the northern kingdom in the flesh, biological Israelites are all scattered throughout the world right now. That's our reality. Some have gotten back into the land, but Yahweh didn't promise some, he promised all. Now we're going to look at how that happens. Verse 2, and you return to Yahweh your Elohim and obey him with all your heart and soul according to all I command you today, you and your children. Then Yahweh your Elohim will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where Yahweh your Elohim has scattered you. Now when we look at that word captivity in the Old Testament, we tend to think of prisoners, jails, prisoners of war, that kind of thing. Captivity is another word for exile. The captivity is where The Assyrians came in, they took you out of the land into captivity in Assyria. The Babylonians came in the land, they took you out of the land into captivity in Babylon. And so when he's talking about being restored from captivity, he's not talking about a jailbreak. He's talking about bringing people back from the exile. Verse 4, if your outcasts are at the ends of the earth, from there Yahweh your Elohim will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. Yahweh your Elohim will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. So this is sort of a prophecy. He's saying, you guys are going to be scattered to the ends of the earth, like the farthest reaches of this world. And when that happens, and you think about me and you want to return to my ways, you and your children, so we're talking multiple generations, then he'll bring us back. It's my personal belief that we're in that time frame right now, and we're all a part of that. And that's exciting. So how did we get to this point? We know how we got to this point. Just a brief history lesson. The kingdom divided under King Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son. And we're going to Ezekiel 37, by the way. Ezekiel 37. After a few hundred years, the northern tribes got taken captive, like I mentioned, by Assyria. They were taken out of the land. And the Assyrians had a policy, we read this in 2 Kings, where they bring people in. That would be like the Chinese conquering America, taking all of us back to China and filling America with like Colombians and Scandinavians, just to name random people groups. That's what they did. So they displaced the people from their native land and brought foreigners in their place. We know that those foreigners that were brought in to replace Israel later became what we call the Samaritans. After a while, they believed that they were biological Israelites. They thought they were the real deal. They made some modifications to the word, like moving the system of worship to Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem. They had some other things. But they were not biological Israelites, even though they thought they were. Okay, so that's the Samaritans. And then, of course, later on, Judah, the Jews, were brought out by Babylon. Now, they were allowed to come back after a while, but the house of Israel, the northern tribes, have never been brought back collectively. They are still in dispersion. They're still in captivity to this day. And it's not common in Judaism, but there are some Jews, there are some rabbis that know this. They're looking forward to the return of Ephraim. They call it the final redemption. We call it, some of us call it the second Exodus or the greater Exodus. Same basic idea describing the same basic event. So Ezekiel 37, we're going to read the whole thing again because it's relevant. The hand of Yahweh was upon me. And this is important. He calls Ezekiel, I don't know if anybody's done this study or not, but we know that the Messiah, the Son of Yahweh, is called the Son of Man. When you excluding him, Ezekiel is called the Son of Man more than anyone else in the Scriptures. And if you do a count by word, he's actually referred to as Son of Man more than the Messiah, which is really interesting. So whenever I see Yahweh telling Ezekiel and he says, Son of Man, do this, I start to think, can I see the Son of Man doing that? And I think in this case, the answer is a resounding yes. The hand of Yahweh was upon me, Ezekiel, and he brought me up by the Spirit out of Yahweh and set me down in the middle of a valley, and it was full of bones. He caused me to pass among them round about, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and lo, they were very dry. He said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? I love it when he does these to his prophets. He asks them a question. He knows they don't know the answer, and so they have to ask him, well, you know. So why don't you just tell me, please? He said to me, O Elohim Yahweh, you know. Verse 4, again he said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh Elohim to these bones. Actually, it's probably Yahweh Adonai there in Ezekiel. Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, that you may come to life. I will put sinews on you, make flesh grow on you, cover you with skin, and put breath in you, that you may come alive. You will know that I am Yahweh. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise. And behold, a rattling, and bones came together, bone to its bone. And I looked, and behold, sinews were on them, and flesh grew, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to the breath, thus says Yahweh Elohim, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain, that they may come to life. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came back into them. And they came to life and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army. Verse 11, then he said to me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is perished. We are completely cut off. These are not Gentiles. This is Israel. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says Yahweh Elohim, behold, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves, my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. Then you will know that I am Yahweh when I have opened your graves and caused you to come up out of your graves, my people. I will put my spirit within you, and you will come to life, and I will place you on your own land. Then you will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken and done it, declares Yahweh. Now, most people, when they read this, they think of spiritual rebirth. They think of a people being like revived, like revival. I see this being brought up every time we have a revival by at least somebody. It's the dry bones coming to life. And there's relevance there. We can look at it that way. But the fact that he's talking about bringing them into the land of Israel, which is a physical place, my personal point of view is he's talking about the resurrection here. He's talking about the actual resurrection, where he literally brings people out of their graves like he said he was going to do, and he gives us our new bodies, whatever they look like, and he brings us into the land. I realize not everybody might agree with that, but to me, why invoke the land if it's strictly a spiritual rebirth? But let's keep going. Verse 15, the word of Yahweh came again to me, saying, and you, son of man, there we go, son of man again, take for yourself one stick and write on it, for Judah and for the sons of Israel, his companions. Then take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, there they are again, and all the house of Israel, his companions. Then join them for yourself one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand, in the Son of Man's hand. Interesting. When the sons of your people speak to you, saying, will you not declare to us what you mean by these? Say to them, thus says Yahweh Elohim, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim. We just read earlier in Genesis 48 why that is. And the tribes of Israel, his companions. And I will put them with it, with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they will be one in my hand. The sticks on which you write will be in your hand before their eyes. Say to them, thus says Yahweh Elohim, behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. So he's going to bring the sons of Israel from among the nations, the Goyim, where they've gone, and he's going to bring them into their land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel, and one king will be king for all of them. And they will no longer be two nations and no longer be divided into two kingdoms. So that split that happened under King Rehoboam is going to be completely reversed. And it's not lost on me that you look at King David and you look at King Solomon before he fell off the rocker. They're both types of Messiah. I forget what Solomon's name is. Is it Jedediah? I think he's got a pet name there that basically means beloved of Yah. And there's other prophecies that kind of connect that to the Messiah. So he's sort of a type, not as much as David, but in his own way. So verse 23, they will no longer defile themselves with their idols or with their detestable things or with any of their transgressions, but I will deliver them from all their dwelling places in which they have sinned and will cleanse them. They will be my people, and I will be their Elohim, or their God. My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. That sounds familiar. I am the good shepherd, right? And they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. That's interesting because the good shepherd is going to do this, and then they're going to be keeping the commandments, which he supposedly freed them from. Interesting. Okay. They will live on the land that I gave to Jacob, my servant, in which your fathers lived, and they will live on it, they and their sons and their sons' sons, forever. And David, my servant, will be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant with them. And I will place them and multiply them and will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place also will be with them, and I will be their Elohim, and they will be my people. And the nations, the Goyim, will know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. So he's getting at a couple things here. He's getting at the stick of Joseph, the stick of Judah, being reunited in the hand of the Messiah, of the king, of the shepherd. We're going to have a restoration where the split nations are going to be brought back into one. And this is going to be in the context of the nations around them seeing this. He's going to sanctify Israel in the midst of the nations, of the Goyim. And we know that sanctify has to do with holiness. So when you're holy, you're being brought out of something and brought into something else. Holiness just means set apart. If I have a multicolor pack of, say paper clips, the colored kinds, and I say, I'm going to be OCD and pick out all the blue ones. What I've done is just made the blue ones holy. I've just removed them from the group and set them apart. That's the most basic way to understand it. So he's using this whole thing to say that when this happens, Israel is going to be separated from the Goyim, from the nations, and they're going to be one kingdom. So we're still going to have that distinction, but it's going to be more pronounced at this point. Okay, so let's go to Jeremiah 3. Jeremiah comes before Ezekiel. Now, remember when the dry bones, they said they had no hope. They had been cut off. They're literally being resurrected. Why do they think they have no hope? What would cause them to say that? Let's go to Jeremiah 3. Some of you know what this is going to refer to. It's a short chapter. We'll read the whole thing. I need to it. There we go. Jeremiah 3. Elohim says, if a husband divorces a wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not that land be completely polluted? But you are a harlot with many lovers, yet you turn to me, declares Yahweh. Lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see, where have you not been violated? By the roads you have sat for them like an Arab in the desert, and you have polluted a land with your harlotry and with your wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld, the rain. There has been no spring rain. Yet you had a harlot's forehead. You refused to be ashamed. Have you not just now called to me, my father? You are the friend of my youth. This is talking about Israel. Will he be angry forever? Will he be indignant to the end? Behold, you have spoken and have done evil things, and you have had your way. Then Yahweh said to me in the days of Josiah the king, have you seen what faithless Israel did? She went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and she was a harlot there. I thought, after she's done all these things, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. So we're talking about Israel and Judah, the two groups here. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went and was a harlot also. Because of the lightness of her harlotry, she polluted the land and committed adultery with stones and trees. Yet in spite of all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but rather in deception, declares Yahweh. So he's talking about this idea that Judah saw what happened to Israel and saw the judgment that came on Israel and actually ramped it up and got worse. So Yahweh actually divorced the house of Israel. Let's call it Joseph, let's call it Ephraim, let's call it the 10 tribes, any way we want. He did not divorce the house of Judah. Now, if he's divorcing them in terms of like a covenantal relationship, we can see why they have no hope. Because they didn't all have the foresight, or hindsight in our case sometimes, to see the big plan. I was talking with, I forget if it was Joe earlier today, or I was talking with somebody about this idea that when you see, when we read Paul's writings, there's a progression. And as far as I can tell, Ephesians was one of the last letters that he wrote. And so you see him talk about this whole Israel thing in Romans, but then by the time he gets to Ephesians, he's talking about this mystery. And he's talking about this whole idea that, the assembly or the church represents the bride of Messiah. And he's getting into all these things. And you almost get the impression, or at least I do, that when you read Paul from beginning to end, he's kind of starting to figure out more as he goes. And he finally has this oh, light bulb moment. Like he really understands the mystery of the Gentiles. And it's like he always sort of knew it, but he didn't like fully get it until Ephesians. But he talks about this idea. And so Israel was divorced, and as such, you know, they're like they don't know. They don't see the big picture. How are we ever going to be reconciled with the one who divorced us? They don't see a clear path. So to me, at least in Ezekiel 37, I can see why they would have no hope, because they don't see a path forward. They don't see a way of reconciliation. But let's keep reading in verse 11. And Yahweh said to me, faithless Israel has proved herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. Go and proclaim these words toward the north. Now this is interesting. We're going to see, and we could do a whole thing on this. When you look at the places where Yahweh is speaking to his people who have been exiled, who have been scattered, he talks about the north a lot. And if you just look at a map, it's not hard to see. Most of the world's landmass is in the north. You know, and so logically, that's where the most people are. But he also talks about from the west, which we'll get into in a minute when we get into Hosea. That one's fascinating to me. But let's keep reading. Verse 12, go and proclaim these words toward the north and say, return, faithless Israel, declares Yahweh. I will not look upon you in anger, for I am gracious, declares Yahweh. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your iniquity, that you have transgressed against Yahweh, your Elohim, and have scattered your favors to the strangers under every green tree. And you have not obeyed my voice, declares Yahweh. Return, O faithless sons, declares Yahweh, for I am a master to you. And I will take you from a city, one from a city and two from a family, and I will bring you to Zion. This is that whole idea of bringing them back out of the captivity. And if you think about families and cities, we're talking about a small number here. This reminds me of Joshua and Caleb being the only ones out of the whole group to come into the promised land. Verse 15, then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you on knowledge and understanding. It shall be in those days when you're multiplied and increased in the land, declares Yahweh, they will no longer say, the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, and it will not come to mind, nor will they remember it, nor will they miss it, nor will it be made again. That's a whole thing right there we can get into. At that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of Yahweh, and all the nations, or the Goyim, will be gathered to it. Now we know in Isaiah and Micah, he talks about this idea that all the nations coming to Zion, to the mountain of Yahweh. Let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, that he may teach us his ways. You know, this is the same thing. All the nations will be gathered to it, to Jerusalem, for the name of Yahweh, nor will they walk any more after the stubbornness of their evil heart. In those days, the house of Judah will walk with the house of Israel, and they will come together from the land of the north to the land that I gave your fathers as an inheritance. And we could go right back to Ezekiel 37 on this. Then I said, Jeremiah, how I would set you among my sons. That's not Jeremiah. Then I said, how I would set you among my sons and give you a pleasant land, the most beautiful inheritance of the nations. And I said, you shall call me my father, and not turn away from following me. Surely as a woman treacherously departs from her lover, so you have dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, declares Yahweh. Let's just finish it out. A voice is heard on the bare heights, the weeping and supplications of the sons of Israel. Why? Because they've perverted their way. They have forgotten Yahweh, their Elohim. In my head, that goes right back to what we read in Deuteronomy 30. Return, O faithless sons. I will heal your faithlessness. Behold, we come to you, for you are Yahweh, your Elohim. Surely the hills are a deception, a tumult on the mountains. Surely in Yahweh, your Elohim, is the salvation of Israel. And I made this point before. When we look at salvation scripturally, in our modern Christian terms, we tend to think of salvation as me, 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 me. Salvation is, I'm going to avoid burning up in that place forever. My biscuits are not going to get burned. That's what we look at salvation for. My default position is eternal hellfire. Messiah came along and said, here's a way out. That's, in a nutshell, how we look at it in modern times. When you look at that word salvation in the scriptures, specifically the Old Testament, it's almost always Yahweh gathering his people out of some trouble. He's saving them from some kind of a dire situation, or he's bringing them back from the exile. So I think it's the same here. When he's talking about the salvation of Israel, he's talking about the return from the captivity. Verse 24, but the shameful thing has consumed the labor of our fathers since their youth, their flocks and their herds, their sons and their daughters. Let us lie down in our shame, and let our humiliation cover us, for we have sinned against Yahweh our Elohim, we and our fathers, from our youth even to this day, and we have not obeyed the voice of Yahweh our Elohim. I think we could say that's true for us. We look at our ancestors, we look at how the cart fell over several generations ago and nobody bothered to pick it back up. We're kind of in that same position. So let's go to Hosea. We're going to read a couple chapters in Hosea. And Hosea is considered a minor prophet, but he was one of the very first, if not the first prophets that came along and said, hey, judgment's coming, Israel. And it's interesting to me because Hosea, or Hoshea, is Joshua's initial name. Before Moses changed it, his name was Hoshea. And then he changed it to, depending on how you pronounce it, Yehoshua or Yahshua. He added a yod to it. And he's going to come talk to the northern kingdom, Ephraim, Joseph. And it's interesting, if you look at the list of kings, Hoshea, Joshua, was the first. He brought Israel into the land. The last king of the northern tribes was also of the same name, Hoshea. And that's also the name of the prophet who's coming to them and saying, y'all about to get kicked out. Like, I find that interesting. So we're going to read Hosea chapter 7. We're going to read Hosea chapter 7. We can read the whole book. When I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is uncovered. Remember, Israel, Ephraim, they're kind of almost synonymous. And the evil deeds of Samaria. Samaria was the capital city of the territory of Ephraim. For they deal falsely. The thief enters in, bandits raid outside, and they do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their deeds are all around them. They are before my face. With their wickedness they make the king glad, and the princes with their lies. Now this idea of Ephraim's sins being before his face, this is not just like they're in front of them where he can see it. This is like in modern terms, like you're showing some type of a rebellious, high-handed, like giving somebody the birdie, we would say in modern times. It's this real like kind of attitude, you know? They're putting it right in his face as an act of rebellion. He's not just casually seeing it. That's the vibe here. Verse 3, with their wickedness they make the king glad, and the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by the baker who ceases to stir up the fire, from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. On the day of our king, the princes become sick with the heat of wine. Sounds like our politicians. He stretched out his hand with scoffers, for their hearts are like an oven as they approach their plotting. Their anger smolders all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. All of them are hot like an oven, and they consume their rulers. All their kings have fallen, none of them calls on me. Verse 8, Ephraim, and this is the crux of what we're looking at here. Ephraim mixes himself with the nations. Mixes himself with the nations, with the goyim. Ephraim has become a cake not turned. So, if you put a cake in the oven and you don't turn it, what happens eventually? It burns. Does anyone like to eat burnt cake? So the cake is ruined. He's basically saying Ephraim is ruined. Okay? He's not saying anything other than that. I know that I saw somebody post a while about this, and I meant to say this as a disclaimer earlier. My intent with this whole thing with the Gentiles and with Israel, I'm not looking at skin color, I'm not looking at biology, I'm not getting into that whole thing. But I will say that I have seen people use this to say that the Israelites were black. They were African, because a cake not turned is black. Why not just say that? You know what I mean? Like, that's not what he's talking about in this specific case. And I'm open to that, but in this specific case, that's not what he's talking about. He's basically saying they're ruined. Verse 9, strangers devour his strength, yet he does not know it. Gray hairs are also sprinkled on him, yet he does not know it. Though the pride of Israel testifies against him, yet they have not returned to Yahweh their Elohim, nor have they sought him for all this. So Ephraim has become like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria. When they go, I will spread my net over them. I will bring them down like the birds of the sky. I will chastise them in accordance with the proclamation to their assembly. Woe to them, for they have strayed from me. Destruction is theirs, for they have rebelled against me. I would redeem them, but they speak lies against me. And they do not cry to me from their heart when they wail on their beds. For the sake of grain and new wine they assemble themselves, they turn away from me. Although I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. They turn, but not upward. They are like a deceitful bow. Their princes will fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. This will be their derision in the land of Egypt. So in the short term, he's prophesying this idea that the nations, Assyria and Egypt, were going to come and deal with Ephraim because of their rebellion, because of their haughtiness, because of all the issues going on, and their refusal to come back to Yahweh. But we see historically, I mentioned earlier, that once this happens, once they get removed by the land as part of their judgment, they still have yet to be brought back in. So that judgment for Ephraim is ongoing to this day. Let's skip over and go to Hosea 11. This is another chapter I love. When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. Who's the fullness of the nations going to come through? We know Messiah. That's one way to put it. But back in Genesis 48, it specifically said Ephraim was going to be the fullness of the Gentiles. Okay? So let's keep that in mind. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with the cords of a man, with bonds of love, and I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws, and I bent down and fed them. They will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria, he will be their king, because they refuse to return to me. The sword will whirl against their cities and will demolish their gate bars and consume them because of their counsels. So my people are bent on turning from me. Though they call them to the one on high, none at all exalts them. And in my opinion, we see this in America today. We see this in the West. We see a lot of lip service among believers, you know. And I hear songs on K-Love and other places about, giving it all for Jesus, and I would give up everything, and you won't give up your bacon. So it's like, let's be real. This is a people talking a big talk, but they're not interested in walking it. Okay, so verse 8, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboiim? My heart is turned over within me, all my compassions are kindled. I will not execute my fierce anger, I will not destroy Ephraim again. Now I want to pause just right here. This is where we got to kind of be careful how we're reading here. He literally just said he was going to destroy Ephraim. They were going to be judged by the nations. But he's saying he's not going to do it, and he's not going to do it again. So like I mentioned earlier, he started that process of judgment on Ephraim. And he's not going to do it again because it's ongoing up until the end of the age. It's not like there's a stop like 1,400 years ago or whatever, and then he's going to resume it. Does that make sense? Like, he's ongoing, so he can't just stop and redo it. Anyway, where was I? For I am Elohim and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Verse 10. They will walk after Yahweh, he will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar, and his sons will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria. And I will settle them in their houses, declares Yahweh. Ephraim surrounds me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. Judah, here we go, Ephraim, Israel, Judah, is also unruly against Elohim, even against the Holy One who is faithful. So do you want to catch that there? Ephraim's sons are coming back from the west. And we read in Ezekiel 37, and there's a whole bunch of other places to say it, they're talking about being gathered back to the land of Israel. Now, if you have a map in your head, if you're a homeschooler, you should, you know that if you go west from the land of Israel, you have a whole bunch of water. Eventually, you hit the boot of Italy, you keep going, maybe through the Straits of Gibraltar, and off you go to good old USA. So, you could say Europe is west. You could say Africa is west if you go longitudinally. But if you just go due west, there's not many places you can find people other than America. So to me, north, I get it. That's Europe, that's Russia, that's Assyria, that's all these places north. But when he throws west in there, that broadens it. Okay? So that's Hosea 11. We've got 4 more scriptures to go. Let's go to Isaiah 49. And remember, we are doing Q&A, so if you have any good questions, we'll take them. No such thing as a bad question. Isaiah 49, we're going to read verses 1 through 6. Listen to me, O islands, and pay attention, you peoples from afar, which would be us. Yahweh called me from the womb. Who is this? The servant. These are the servant chapters of Isaiah. Yahweh called me from the womb. From the body of my mother he named me. He has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he has concealed me. And he has also made me a select arrow. He has hidden me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I shall show my glory. But I said, I've toiled in vain. I've spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Yet surely the justice due to me is with Yahweh, and my reward is with my Elohim. And now says Yahweh, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob, Israel, back to him, so that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of Yahweh, and my Elohim is my strength. He says, he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also make you a light of the nations, the Goyim. Why? So that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. So in the context of this servant restoring Jacob, bringing him back, he's talking about this reaching out to the Goyim, to the nations who are scattered around, and he's calling it salvation. It's this same kind of idea. So, and Paul's going to get to it, but just to kind of, I thought about doing it, but I thought it would be kind of cumbersome. If you imagine like a tank of water, okay? And I did this a week or two ago. But like if you imagine a tank of water, and let's call that water the nations, the Goyim, the Gentiles. And let's say that this lukewarm coffee of mine is Israel. And let's say I pour that in there, okay? Now, initially, as it kind of trickles down, you're going to be able to tell where the coffee is and where the water is, right? You're going to be able to see that distinction. If you were quick enough and took a spoon in there or a ladle or something, you could pull the coffee back out. You could separate the coffee from the water. But what we're talking about is we've gone way past that. We're to the point now to where Ephraim is thoroughly mixed in with that water. If you want to separate the coffee from the water, the Israelites, the Ephraimites, whatever you want to call them, from the water, from the nations, have fun. It ain't happening. You know, we got a room full of people here and nobody has a clue if they're biological Israelites or not. At least I don't think. Any takers? Anybody know? No. So what can we know for sure that we are? Okay? And this is why I frame like, you know, who's a Jew, who's an Israelite, who are the Gentiles? To me, that's the wrong question. The right question is, what is the relationship between the two groups? That's kind of what we're getting at. So we got to go to Paul. Why? Because Paul said. Let's go to Romans 9. Brought this one in for Dan. Dan's always bringing up Romans 9 for good reason. Romans 9, we're going to read verses 1 through 18. I am telling the truth in Messiah. I am not lying. My conscience testifies with me in the Holy Spirit. Now remember what I said earlier about this idea that why was Paul chosen instead of somebody like Cornelius? Okay, Paul was educated under Gamaliel. He was one of the leading scholars of his day. That guy had insight into the Torah, into the prophets that we can only dream of. And you send him out to the Gentiles? There's only one reason I can see that you would do that, because you need a guy who can tell the difference between the coffee and the water. You need a guy who can go out and understands these concepts, can go out in these nations, and he can understand, yeah, you guys are biological Gentiles. Some of you are biological Israelites, but spiritual Gentiles. You know, it's hard for people to grasp, but he's talking about that here in Romans. And if you send Cornelius out, Cornelius doesn't necessarily understand that. To me, Cornelius would be logical. If all you're doing is saying the gospel is John 3:16, which is great, it is. Cornelius could do that just fine. But if you're talking about the gospel of the kingdom, and you're getting into this kind of stuff, that's above Cornelius' pay grade. You bring in the big guns like Paul. So Romans 9, 1 through 18. Where were we? Verse 2. That I have great sorrow and unceasing grief in my heart. For I wish I could that I myself were accursed, separated from Messiah for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. This reminds me of when Moses was like, no, just take me. Just write me out of your book, spare them. Paul's doing the same thing here. Paul is literally willing to give up his eternal life for the sake of his people. Now, what does Messiah say about greater love? Greater love has no man that he would give his life for his friends. Okay, so verse 4, who are Israelites, so he's talking about his kinsmen according to the flesh. He's talking about biological Israel. Who are Israelites, to whom belongs the adoption as sons, and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the temple service and the promises. Now, it's interesting to me, in replacement theology, dual covenant theology, all these different things, the Gentile church replaced Israel. The Jews are out. They rejected the Messiah, they're out. Now, if you go dual covenant, you can say they're still in. They have their Jewish thing going on, and we have our Gentile thing going on. But what is Paul saying here? He's speaking in the present tense. He says, who are Israelites, to whom belongs, in current, the adoption of sons, and the glory and the covenants, and the giving of the Torah, and the temple service, and the promise. He's speaking present tense at that time, not past tense, so many decades earlier at Calvary. He's saying this is still an ongoing reality. Verse 5, whose are the fathers, and from whom is the Messiah according to the flesh, who is over all, Elohim blessed forever. Amen. But it is not as though the word of Elohim has failed, for they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel. Nor are they all children, because they are Abraham's descendants. This is why I want to start off with Abraham. But through Isaac your descendants will be named. That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of Elohim, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants. For this is the word of promise. At this time I will come, and Sarah will have a son. And not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born, and had not done anything good or bad, so that Elohim's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. It was said to her, the older will serve the younger. We just kind of read about this with Manasseh and Ephraim, right? Just as it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau I hated. Which Hebraically doesn't mean like, I hate your guts, that kind of hate. It means love less. Okay, it's kind of like a hierarchy of love. He doesn't hate Esau's guts, because Yahweh's not partial. He just loves him less. There's a weaker relationship there. Okay, so verse 14. What shall we say then? There is no injustice with Elohim, is there? May it never be. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then, it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on Elohim who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. Throughout the whole earth. That kind of sounds familiar. We've been reading about that. The nations live around the whole earth. Israel, Ephraim was scattered around the whole earth. Okay? And if you think about the time of the Exodus, it started off as a local thing in the land of Goshen. By the time they got to the River Jordan, by the time they started getting up to the Promised Land, the fear was in the people. They heard. They knew what happened. And so Yahweh used what he did with Pharaoh in Egypt there to glorify himself among the nations, or the Goyim. And I see the same thing kind of here. So, verse 18, so then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. So I just want to pause right there. If we look at this idea of the second Exodus, the final redemption, these kind of concepts that we've been talking about, it's this idea, the way I look at it is it's going to happen in front of the nations. It's not going to be this rapture where people just disappear. It's like, where did they go? Did their weight loss program, was it that successful? Wow, you lost all your weight. Go slim fast. That's not what it is. We're talking about this idea that his people are being taken from a people that are dominant over them in some capacity. In this world, we're all subjugates to this worldly system. We kind of don't have a choice. Even when people go off grid, you're not really out of the system. You're better off than the rest of us, but you're not ever really out from under this system. So anyway, in the last days prophecies, we have this idea that the nations are going to see this, and it's going to glorify Yahweh, just like what the first Exodus. So now we got to go to Romans 11. We got to go to Romans 11. We'll read the whole chapter. And I like how my Zondervan New American Standard has this headed. It says, Israel is not cast away. But why does everybody teach that it was? Who knows? I say then, Elohim has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul is saying, I'm a biological Israelite, okay? He's establishing that. Elohim has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he pleads with Elohim against Israel? Master, they have killed your prophets, they have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. But what is the divine response to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to Elohim's gracious choice. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace is no longer grace. Now I want to pause just a minute there. If we go back to verse 4, does he say, I have kept myself 7,000 Israelites who have not bowed the knee to Baal? Does he say 7,000 Jews who have not bowed? No, he says 7,000 men. Okay, so it's presumed that we're talking Israelites here, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's Ger in the midst. Maybe it's some of those people that came in, like Ruth, and said, I want to be a part of this magnificent thing I see here. Some of those could be there. We don't know, but I do think it's possible. Where was I? Verse 7. Okay. Verse 7. What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, the Elohim gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and bend their backs forever. I say then, he's talking about biological Israel here. I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles, the Goyim, the nations, to make them jealous. Now, Now, their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles. How much more will their fulfillment be? But I'm speaking to you that are Gentiles. He's talking to the Romans here. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. If somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead, the resurrection? Excuse me. If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive, remember he's talking to the Gentiles here, the Romans, were grafted in among them and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in, right? Those Jews were kicked out so the Gentiles could be brought in and replace them, right? Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if Elohim did not spare the natural branches, the flesh and blood Israelites and Jews, he will not spare you either. So he's making it really clear. This ain't about your DNA. It ain't about your skin color. It's not about where you came from. It's about how you act. It's about your faith. It's about your heart. Verse 22, behold then, the kindness and severity of Elohim. To those who fell, severity, but to you, Elohim's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. for Elohim is able to graft them in again. So imagine that. Those Israelites we read about in Ezekiel 37 who had no hope, Elohim the whole time had a plan to bring them back. It's funny, like sometimes we think we see the whole picture, and we realize, no, we're just looking at like one little puzzle piece here, but from our perspective, we think we see the whole thing. I think it was the same back then. Verse 24, for if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation. That a partial, we read this earlier, but I'm going to read it again, now that we kind of have a fuller picture of what this means. That a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. From the standpoint of the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of Elohim's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of Yahweh are irrevocable. For just as you once were disobedient to Elohim, remember he's talking to the nations here, the Gentiles, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. For Elohim has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may show mercy to all. Oh, the depth and the riches and the depth and the riches both of the wisdom and the knowledge of Elohim. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of Yahweh, or who became his counselor? Or who was first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So he's explaining. He's using his knowledge of the scriptures to explain who real Israel is, who the real Gentiles are. And anyone can be an Israelite, and anyone can be a Gentile. He's making it crystal clear. So like I said earlier, when we look at the difference between the two, it's more like the relationship between the two. You can't be both. You can't be of the nations around Israel. Like, just geographically, you can't live over in Edom and simultaneously live in Hebron. You can't do it. You can't be in two places at once. You can't be in two kingdoms at once. So if we go back to the whole water thing, okay? Basically what he just said here, if this coffee is Israel, when the coffee was warm, when it was hot, it was great. This is lukewarm, I don't want to drink it, okay? That's kind of the state of the Israelites. What does he say to the Laodicean assembly? You're lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth, right? You're no good to me. So if I dump this in that water because now it's not good like it used to be, what happens? The coffee goes and percolates through that water. Now we've got a whole thing of diluted coffee. If I decide I want coffee again, I can't do it, but the one who sees the hearts and minds of men can. He can pull anything out of that container and make it good coffee if he wants to again. And then this is what I think we're talking about here. He's basically saying, if this is Israel, if this is the promises of Yahweh, unless they had messed up, unless they had transgressed, unless they had gone the way they did, they would have stayed in this coffee cup. They would have never been dumped in the pool with all those Gentile heathen. But because they were, now Yahweh says, I want a nice cup of hot coffee. Where can I can turn water into wine. Maybe I could also turn water into coffee. So does that make sense? He's able to look in that vessel full of Gentile water with Israelite coffee mixed through it, and he's able to just pull coffee out of it. And it's not based on the original state, because the original state doesn't exist anymore. In that container, there is no coffee, there is no water, there is a hybrid. Ephraim has mixed himself with the nations. So let's conclude with Ephesians chapter 2. I have to go here. Love this chapter. Ephesians chapter 2, and yes, we will read the whole thing. I'm skipping over Galatians. I have read Galatians. I'm just not going to do it here. Ephesians chapter 2. And keep in mind, he's writing to a predominantly Gentile in flesh assembly here. There probably are Israelites by the flesh here, but it's predominantly Gentiles. And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. He's talking about this idea of obeying and disobeying again. Among them, we too, he's speaking as an Israelite now, among them too, we all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. So we see that. Yahweh was just as wrathful towards his children Israel as he was everyone else. It's not like they got some free pass and said, but I'm Jewish? Oh, I'm an Ephraimite? No, he judges everybody impartially, even his own people. Verse 4, but Elohim, being rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Messiah. By grace you have been saved. And raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Messiah Yahshua. Why? So that in the ages to come he might show the surpassing riches of his grace and kindness toward us in Messiah Yahshua. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and not that of yourselves, it is the gift of Elohim, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. Now I could just stop there if we were meeting tomorrow on Sunday, and that would be all there is to it, but we're going to keep going. Verse 10, for we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yahshua for good works. Wait, we were created for good works? We're supposed to do works? What? Which Elohim prepared beforehand so that we could walk in them. What good works could he possibly have created beforehand and told his people to walk in them? Everybody scratch their heads. Okay. Do we have lice? I hope not. Okay. Good thing my wife's not here. Okay. She doesn't have lice. She's just had issues with it in the past, and she's like paranoid of lice. I don't blame her. Okay. The school system. Yay. Okay, so verse 11. Therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without Elohim in the world. Now we just read in Ezekiel 37 how even Israel says our hope is cut off. We're done. Well, the Gentiles are out there in the same situation, because whether or not we have hope or not is based on our relationship with our Creator. And that's not based on our DNA. But now in Messiah, verse 13, Yahshua, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. Now this brought near, I want to focus in on this. This is the concept. If you go back and read the book of Esther, okay, it's a great example. You don't just rock up in there and say, hey king, what's up, bro? No. To go before the king, you have to be brought near. It's a very serious thing. It's not casual. There has to be intent there. There has to be a degree of reverence. There's protocols. So this isn't just, let's just stroll up there with our buddy Jesus and everything's cool. This is a very serious, reverential kind of thing. Verse 14, for he himself is our peace, who made both groups, he's talking about the Israelites or the Jews and the Gentiles. He made them into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. Now, what he's talking about here is, we've been reading this whole time about Israel and Judah, Israel and Judah, Israel and Judah. When we read Ezekiel 37, it never says Gentiles, as far as the two sticks. And when we read the New Covenant in Jeremiah 31 and Hebrews 8, it never says the Gentiles. It's with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So this is where I think, Paul is like kind of later on here, he kind of has this realization. Oh, this is how the Gentiles get in. Because they're not the house of Israel, they're not the house of Judah. How do they have any hope unless they can become one of those groups? And I think that's kind of what he's talking about here, is there's this division between the two groups. How do we overcome that? So back up, verse 14. For he himself is our peace, talking about the Messiah, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. How? By abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. Now, when we read English, we see commandments there. In the Greek, it's dogma. Dogma is never used of Yahweh's commandments. It's used of man's systems, man's commandments, man's laws, man's decrees. If we look at how things were back then, if you look at the tabernacle, there was no court of the Gentiles. If we look at Solomon's temple, there was no court of the Gentiles. In Herod's temple, there was. Okay? So the Gentiles had this whole, like, they couldn't even get close to the actual temple. They were like, you guys are out. And then this is, we see this later when Peter gets reprimanded by Paul in Galatians for excluding himself from the Gentiles again. When he goes to Cornelius, he says, it's not lawful for me to come in here. You're a Gentile. That's these dogmas. That's not scriptural. None of that is in Yahweh's Torah. None of it is in the prophets. That was cooked up by man. Those divisions were put there by man. And Messiah's coming along and saying, I have another way in. You don't have to stay outside the Gentile wall, the gates, or whatever. You've always been welcome to come near. And so I think this is what Paul is talking about. Where were we here? Verse 16. And he might reconcile them both in one body to Elohim through the cross, or through the stake, or the tree, however you want to translate that, by it having put to death the enmity. So this division between Israel and the Gentiles, Messiah has put that to death. It's not the Torah that he's putting to death. It's the enmity between the two groups. So now we don't have any excuses anymore for why the Gentiles and the Israelites can't be part of the same family. Verse 17, and he came and preached peace to those who were far away and peace to those who were near. Those who were far away, the Gentiles, those who were near, the Israelites. For through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of Elohim's household. Now, I mentioned ger earlier. If you were a ger in the land, you had most of the rights and privileges of a native-born Israelite, but not all. You could assimilate all you wanted to, but you were not one-to-one equal with them. You had more rights than like a stranger who was completely outside the goyim, but you weren't quite the same level. There were still some commandments where you could do certain things with native Israelites, you could not do those with certain, the Israelites, but you could with the ger. Okay, so it wasn't apples to apples equivalent. But he's saying here that all that stuff, like in this whole thing, we're not even talking about the idea of ger anymore. There's no middle group. There's no like Gentiles, ger, Israel. The ger group in the middle is gone. Okay, does that make sense? Where were we here? But you are fellow citizens with the saints and are of Elohim's household. And having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Messiah Yahshua himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together is growing into a holy temple in Yahweh, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling place of Elohim and the Spirit. So if you think about this in terms of like back then, the Gentiles were considered, they called them dogs. Like the woman at the well, like don't even the children get the dogs get the tables or the crumbs from the table, right? They were calling the Gentiles dogs back then. Like that's rough, that's offensive. That's how they thought of them. And you could say today, Judah still thinks of the Gentiles, the goyim, generally in the same way. I have seen videos of sermons where rabbis have called us dogs. I'm not saying that's everybody, but it's there. That whole mindset. And so if you think about this, if from a Jewish point of view, they consider themselves to be holy and sanctified, and the Gentiles are unholy and irredeemable, you don't make a holy building out of both types of stone. You can only use holy stone to make a holy building. So it's this whole language here that he's taken away all of these artificial separations and distinctions we have between the two groups. And if we go back to Abraham, and that's why I want to set this up, we could say those distinctions were never really there. They were there superficially in the flesh, but spiritually they were never in place at all. The Gentiles always had a way in, they just didn't always know it. And so like with this whole coffee thing, now that the coffee's been dumped in the water, everybody has a chance to become coffee or everybody has a chance to become water. If Yahweh would have never dumped the coffee, Israel, into the water, then to this day the Gentiles would have no hope. There's no way in. But the Messiah is able to take all that water and turn it into coffee. Is anybody thirsty for coffee now that I've been saying it like 14,000 times? Yeah. So, I mean, it's a relatively basic concept, but it's really important, you know. It's like you don't have to be a Gentile, you know. And looking at somebody and saying, oh, it happened. And looking at somebody and saying, oh, they've got it made because they're Jewish is just as dumb as saying, I have no hope because I'm a Gentile. So we'll wrap it up there. Like I said, if we were going to go like cover to cover in detail, this could be a 3 or 4 part series, easy. I've seen people do that. But there's no really need to go into that. So everybody in this room, if you want to be, is Israel. You know, if you don't want to be Israel, then why are you in this room? I'm glad you guys are all in the room. Okay, so we'll take questions, comments, and strong opinions.